Up our invited guests, and we are going to begin with Marcus Mundy, Executive Director of the Coalition of Communities of Color.
Thank you for inviting me today and letting me say a couple of words. I was just going to make it up and speak extemporaneously, but I'll be quick, but I'll say a couple of things that I was just jotting down as I was listening to the reason for all of this. So I was supposed to answer the question, why should the Black community engage with this charter, with this and the districting process? And maybe not answer it, but at least reflect on it, opine about it, and share some thoughts. And I'll start with just saying, like, Dick Bogle, Charles Jordan, Joanne Hardesty, Mingus Maps, and then I'll add in Carmen Rubio and Renee Gonzalez. Now, the first four were the four Black members of the city council, the only four that Portland has ever had. And the last two were people of color, Carmen Rubio and Renee Gonzalez. I've met all six. I knew all six. A couple have passed away, but I've known them, I've met them, I've sat down with them, I've heard their thoughts, and that's both wonderful and also a shame. I've only been here 20 years. I should know every council person of color that has sat on the Portland City Council in over 100 years. So just that fact alone makes me want to urge my fellow Black residents of Portland to get engaged with this process. There's a reason that we're only had 4 Black commissioners over all that time. And the reason is, one was that I noticed it on the districting thing. The charge of this commission, you all said it is not to dilute certain populations or whatever. The charter as it exists was set up to dilute those very votes. It was meant to dilute different factions of people, not always people of color, but it was meant to dilute certain parts of Portland and keep the same people getting elected over time. So I applaud the commission for what they've done and how they've constructed this. Oh, see, my stuff went out, sorry. But one of the reasons why I think it's so important that you hear this testimony from these communities and that you've constructed this is that I like the district process. I'm engaged in the process. In fact, our group, the Coalition of Communities of Color, was one of the champions of this. And we believe that by doing this, we will have more candidates of color, not guaranteed to win, but with the opportunity to win, with a better chance to win, and working in smaller districts where their numbers aren't diluted. I looked at the numbers that you all had, and the biggest percentage of Black folks in any one of the districts I thought was around 9%, and mostly it's 7 or 8 or 6 or 3% in one district. These are small percentages. So as much as I'm up here, well, kind of jumping up and down about Black folks, I'm also saying that we have to have people of color, we have to have allies, we have to have the ability to build something that's in our name, coalitions that are for the common good and shared interests. So I'll wrap it up because I know you have other folks, but this charter process gives me the opportunity and the hope that we can do that we can come together and have some shared interests and not have round up the usual suspects of powerful people or businesses or determine how this city's going to run. I want the people to determine how it's going to run. So that's it. The last thing I'll say is I just urge every resident, whoever they are, to engage, but I especially urge and challenge Black folks and people of color to step up in this process, to vote, to run for office, but whatever you do, just engage, for goodness sake. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mundy. We really appreciate you coming here tonight. Our next invited guest is Kim McCarty, Executive Director of the Community Alliance of Tenants.
Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. I really want to thank our host, SEI, for this opportunity for everyone to gather. I'm Kim McCarty, the Executive Director for the Community Alliance of Tenants. We represent tenants throughout the state of Oregon, but we have our history here in Portland. And our mission is to especially serve low-income tenants and our communities of color throughout the state. And I'm here to say regarding these districts, it's really important, the work that you're doing to set boundaries, make these lines, find our common interests. There are many common interests amongst tenants. And what we know is that tenants are not represented on our city council. They're not represented in most of our areas of leadership. The one person I can think of is Joanne Hardesty. We're also not well represented. I want to speak specifically to the Black community, as Marcus just did. And so when we're doing this process, what was the real goal? The goal is to have that representation, to have those common interests, to have some power behind it, and the districts are one way of doing that, and we also want tenants to have more say, and what we know about tenants is that in Portland, most of our Black tenants cannot afford to live in the central city. We know in the last couple of years that Black tenants represent 70% of those who are renting. And we also know that when rent assistance was so critical, most of that rent assistance was being distributed in the central corridor along I-205. We know that of the individuals in Portland that were trying to access the Portland Defenders, the Portland Defense Project to prevent evictions, that almost 40% of those individuals were from Black households. So I just point that out to illustrate the disparities that Black households face in Portland, that they specifically face as tenants, and how critical it is that they have a voice in the decisions that are being made. Decisions like these boundaries, decisions about transportation, decisions about the quality of housing that's being built, decisions about how affordable that housing will be, and can our households afford that housing? Can we still even live in Portland? Because we know over the last 10 years, the pressures on Black households has led to, in a very short period of time, widespread displacement, almost to the point of displacing the a huge amount of the Black community to other parts of the state. So those are just some of my comments. I also just wanted to say that there's a lot of dissimilarity in terms of what renters experience. We know that the quality of housing and the amount of rental housing in East Portland is different than Central East Portland or from the West Side. While there is natural affordable housing in parts of the West Side, especially along the Barber Boulevard corridor, on the whole, it's far more expensive. And you can see that, as an example, rent assistance was far less distributed in those areas. There are, of course, pockets of affordable housing in the Central District of downtown on the West Side, and equally so on the East Side. But the amount of naturally affordable housing, what I mean is not subsidized housing, is predominantly on the East Side of Portland. So I urge you all to take this information and overlay it on the decisions that you're making about districts and about boundaries, and do so with the intent of making sure that individuals and households with common interests really are elevated in the end, and that they're going to have the ability to have their interests heard on this council. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Our next invited guest is Stephen Green, Executive Director of the Business for a Better Portland.
Thank you. One, thank you for having us here today. I'm Stephen Green, I'm a Portland native, grew up here, I've lived in Woodlawn for the last 20 years. Worked for the city of Portland for 10 plus years, got to work with amazing people like Kim. And today I want to speak to a little bit, my degree's in economics and my minor was in demography, so like census data, like census blocks, ACS, don't get me started. But specifically, we have the largest Black and Latinx population that Portland's ever had as of today. They're not all required to live in 97211 and 212. but it's a very young population, right? So the average age in the black community is 31, in the Latinx community it's 27, in the white community it's 37. So when I go through the website looking at GIS of the maps that you all are making, I notice there's something that says voting age. I assume that means 18 or over? Is that correct? I see some head nods. 18 and over. We all know when we look into voting data, the people that vote generally aren't 18 years old. They're generally not 28 years old. They're generally not 38 years old. They're older than that. So one of the things I would love to learn more about from the committee is how are you taking the information on the high level macro, on the census data around communities of color, and then how are you weaving in the realities of who votes, disenfranchisement, some of the information that Kim was talking about around renters and the amount of renters that are voting, what percentage that is versus homeowners, and then more about the process. I think you all have been really great about engaging with community, but when I saw those numbers, is that correct? Only less than 200 people have engaged in the meetings? Is that what I read correctly up on that?
200 draft maps.
200 draft maps, gotcha. Whew. Feels a lot better. We got over 600,000 people, so I feel a lot better about that. So one, again, thank you. I'm excited to do a meeting next week with Commissioner Fleischman, where he's going to be able to talk about what these maps mean for businesses and be able to expand on that. But I'd love to know more about how the committees engage with communities of color. Commissioner Lumley's been really, really open about talking with communities of color. I'd love to know what that looks like. You extended a couple times working with the black community and speaking on our behalf. I'd love to know what that looked like and how you can maybe apply that to some of the other areas. I think, what's it look like to work with folks in Selwood? What's it look like to work with folks in Central Eastside? What are some of those learnings? And, it gives me pause when I hear someone speak for us, right? Well, I'd love to hear more about that so people can go from feeling pause and going, oh, wow, okay, that's great to hear. We've got someone who's really, really leaning into our community and advocating for us. So I appreciate you taking the time. I'm looking forward to the time that I'm going to get next week with Commissioner Fleischman and Commissioner Judd and learning more from you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our final invited guest is community organizer Camille Trummer.
I'm a little short, so I'm going to have to pull this down. Good evening, everyone. My name is Camille Trummer. I use pronouns like she and her. I'm a social impact consultant and fourth generation Portlander. Thank you so much for holding this community meeting. It's really important that we collect community input and insights to inform something as significant as changing the way that our city government will function and exploring ways that will establish modes of power. So one of the things that I had questions about or gave me slight pause was outreach and engagement. I'm an outreach engagement specialist. I do it for the City of Portland and many other entities and nonprofit organizations. And when I think about inclusive engagement, right, what are the methodologies that you've used to ensure that voices who experience barriers to participating in civic projects like this have an opportunity to be here tonight, to be at previous hearings, and to be a part of future engagement? It's really important to acknowledge that there are folks across the city that have access, resources, and time, and there are many folks, many Portlanders, that do not. And so we have an opportune moment as we think about changing our city government to actually have it reflect the city of Portland based on input from voices we usually do not hear from. So I'd love to just leave you with this question of how are you going to continue to outreach and engage communities, particularly our most vulnerable communities, so that they have an opportunity to have their voice heard and centered as you think about the ways in which community input will inform the draft maps. The other thing that I want to talk about is just, I fundamentally believe, especially as somebody who was born and raised here, that we should be rethinking and reimagining our city government, right? So that we can increase access and opportunity and invite ways to create shared prosperity for folks that want to represent and work in deep collaboration with communities to create inclusive and equitable and just policy. But that goes hand in hand with outreach and engagement. And so if we don't do outreach and engagement well and right and in an inclusive way and an accessible way, we don't have the opportunity to invite folks to cultivate candidates that then could be the next generation of our city government leaders. And so one of the things that I observed when looking at these maps is, how are we as a collective, as a community, going to begin to mitigate the creation of boundaries and maps that may inadvertently create concentration of power? When I think about the West Side and I think about the stark differences between the West Side and the East Side, me having been born and raised in North and Northeast Portland, went to Benson High School, we all can recall the deep disparities across these two different places in one city, East and West, right? And so I want us to think, I want us as a community, not just commissioners here, us as a community, to think about how do we mitigate the creation of power by inadvertently creating maps that centralize folks that have far more access and privilege than others. And yes, there is intersectionality when you think about access to transit and housing and public health resources. But if we don't think about this very closely and examine these boundaries that we're establishing very closely, we will inadvertently create spaces and places and maps that will reinforce the power that has created deep disparities that my community in particular still experiences to this day. Has not changed, it's gotten worse. So I leave us, collective us, with this question. How are we going to think about this critically and perhaps reverse engineer the way that we create boundaries and maps so that we actually are creating shared prosperity and equal access to opportunity and not regenerating the same centralization of power that has led to the inequitable policies. When we think about land use policy, that is burdening and has caused historical harm that is still experienced today. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight.